My advice would be, control the risk. First and foremost, watch out for, position sizing, and just, in general, it's a game of staying alive and being able to protect your capital and compound.
Diego, welcome to my Life in 4 Trades.
Thanks for having me.
So we have 4 of your trades, and the way you organize them is very interesting. We'll jump into them in a moment. But first, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where'd you grow up? What were you like as a kid?
Well, I'm originally from Spain. I'm a mining and petroleum engineer. I did my master's in mineral economics at the Colorado School of Mines in the US and the French Institute of Petroleum in Paris. And I did my thesis in something called real options, which basically looks at value in real assets using option theory. It's a bit of a side joke. One of my professors there, Graham Davis, would describe a lettuce as a call option on a salad, and that's kind of how crazy it was. But I guess that really marked me in many ways. It sort of opened up this idea of options, and started to look at life very much, not just the financial options, but through that lens. So everything's an option. Book is an option, is the right, but not the obligation to read or whatever. And so I was very lucky to have the opportunity to start in financial markets in London.
Were you always a sort of math person? Like, did you? Oh, yeah. So this really sort of spoke to you.
Yeah, I sort of followed a little bit my father, my family, engineer and economist. So for me, it was, very natural. But I didn't.
Were you a nerdy guy?
Not really. I've been quite balanced. I would say I was quite sporty. 20 kilos ago, I was okay. Football player. And so I was very lucky to have the opportunity to join JP Morgan in London in the late 90s. So I started trading FX and commodity markets. And then I was with Goldman Sachs, with Merrill Lynch in primarily the macro commodity foreign exchange area.
Right.
And then I had the opportunity to move on to the buy side with my own firm, as well as working for some large players like Bluecrest or Diamond. Before I went back to Spain, and I set up, continued this path, which we'll talk now a little bit about, following that world of options and volatility and trading and tail risk. And so I've been in that field with my own firm, but also now part of a bigger project which has brought me back to London. Which is great. Okay. So I'm sort of closed circle, having been in Madrid, New York, Singapore, and then back to London. And in addition to my experience on the buy side and the sell side, I'm also a book author. Written 2 books. The first one, bestseller on the energy markets, which is the first thing that brought me over to realvision, I think back in 2015. And then a second book called The Anti-Bubbles, and which
we've talked about that. So you're a real chronic underachiever, huh?
Fair enough.
Putting us all to shame.
No.
So wait, let me take a step back before we get into your trade. So you sort of came through the sort of mining, natural resource engineering part of it, but really sort of caught on when you took that options class, really took you down the financial route. When you went to London, so you're from Spain, you moved to London, so that's a sort of different culture, and then you're really in the thick of investment banking. Did you get to the investment bank or the floor or the trading desk and say, wow, these are my people? Or was it a little bit of a culture shock for you?
I was very much thinking I would work in engineering.
That's why
even when I did my master's, that really kind of opened my perspective. I think being exposed to the people, the culture, it sort of opened the world that I hadn't really considered. So when I started applying for different jobs, I took that on as an opportunity, a possibility, and beggars ain't choosers. So when you get your first job, in many ways, I think it's probably more important. Your first job marks your career sometimes more even than what you studied. So in that way, starting the trading role, it was I didn't fully appreciate what it meant at the time. To be honest, all I knew is JP Morgan, London, and 27,000 pounds, which is what it was at the time.
And sometimes that's
and I
good
had no
to
idea.
go in without
I had no idea
all of that.
about anything else. No, I didn't know. If it could have been any other job, but it happened to be a trading job. So that kind of marked my career from there. But
did you
feel
like
very
London?
Lucky. I love London. I met my wife there. My 3 kids, were born there.
So you weren't a Spaniard who got there and said the weather's horrible.
It's close. My mom complained in the early days, until I went to Singapore, and she was sort of hoping that I would get back to London, because obviously Singapore was so much farther away.
So much further.
But London's lovely. We're happy to be back.
Hey everyone, have you yet checked out the incredible, groundbreaking new Real Vision platform? See, we've built something that allows you to live your financial life in one place. We bring together the knowledge, tools, and network to help you thrive in your financial journey. We've got AI tools to help expand your knowledge. We've got courses and education. We've got note-taking. We've got pricing and charting. And in addition, we've got obviously the world's best content, both on macro and crypto, to bring everything together. And in addition, you get access to the Real Vision network. That's our tens of thousands of members across the world, where you can connect and chat to them about what really matters to you. Anyway, it's free, realvision.com. We'll see you there.
Let's jump into your trades. And this is really interesting, because sometimes people give us life trades and sometimes they give us sort of a job or an actual trade. The first one you gave us was unconscious incompetent. So tell us a little bit, and they're all going to sort of fit play on that.
When you invited me over, I thought, if I was on the other side, what would I in some ways want to hear? So I think on the part of it, there's a chronological side of how you go through your life. On the other hand, there's a learning path, and that's where this framework of consciousness and competence, I use it a lot, and I think about it a lot, and I also wanted to link it to some sort of lesson learned. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, the idea was, okay, let's pick 4 traits in 4 different stages of my life. And I think this framework starts with unconscious incompetence, which is when you don't know that you don't know, which is obviously the most dangerous one. And so from there, you progress to conscious incompetence. You know that you don't know. And then you move on to, in some ways, conscious competence. So you know what you know, you don't know what you don't know, and then eventually you get to a level of expertise, master level, where you just know, right?
It's wisdom.
It's unconscious competence. You just know, right?
Yeah.
And things come up very naturally. And I think the fascinating thing about this is, we learn in silos. So you might be an unconscious competent person in sports, but you could be unconsciously incompetent in politics or economics or whatever. And in my view, and this is something I work on a lot, is sort of bridging those worlds. So, and that's why I've done a lot of work in, linking engineering and concepts. Like, for example, when I talk about volatility, I talk about, fluid mechanics and how you have effectively nature and the market's transition from laminar regime to turbulent regime. And there are a lot of similarities and a lot of things we can learn. So in some ways, the idea is, can we connect those worlds? Can we effectively take areas of competence and apply them? And that's why I think analogies, anybody who knows me knows I use tons of sporting analogies. I think it's a very powerful way to explain concepts. So I thought, okay, let's start with, one of the big mistakes, perhaps very early in my career. And it was one of my, early trades from a personal trading perspective. And this is back in the late 90s, it's .com-ish, things are very babulistic. Everyone's making a lot of money. And
everyone's
it was crazy. Everything was just going up. Everyone was a genius. And I think at that time, the idea of the market collapsing was, you're young, you're inexperienced. And so you understand the options, and the market's paying you money for effectively taking the risk that something would collapse. And so the idea of selling options, particularly puts, looked very enticing because, it was all one way. You're naive. You don't know that you don't know. And you're sort of it's almost like the worst thing that can happen is that you are successful at the beginning, right? And so you might do it once and may do it twice. And I think the key message I want to leave with people is do not confuse strategies that are selling options with income. Because what tends to happen is people start to build the house from the roof. They say, look, I want to make whatever, 1,000 or 10,000, whatever it is a month. So what do I need to do to generate that? And so you end up potentially selling optionality and risk in a very high notional, very leveraged way. And it could work for a while. You build confidence, you start trading bigger, and eventually, boom, things happen. And so ultimately, when you are selling options, it's an insurance play. You could be collecting premium for a while, but it's an expectancy game, right? So at the end of the day, particularly if you're doing it with leverage and without delta hedging or other ways of protecting, it could be extremely dangerous. So I was very lucky and very blessed that I was hit in what was a large amount for me at the time, but not big enough that it sort of knocks you off.
Wiped you out, yeah.
And yeah, so I think that really was a very valuable lesson. I think since then, these things help you, gain a bigger perspective, and it woke me up into the next stage of, okay, you don't really understand what you're doing. And so I think that's part of the process. So it was a very valuable lesson. I've seen so many friends over the years, starting to trade and being involved in options. And I think the temptation of selling options, thinking it's almost free money, or I want to generate income from this and sort of building the house through the roof, is extraordinarily dangerous. If you want to do that, you need to do it in the right size. And the right size may not generate sufficient income, but you need to focus on the actual level of risk and what you're doing, rather than thinking, I want to generate X. What do I need to do about it?
Jumping ahead to that outcome.
And so I think it's something that I suspect many of the people might be in that phase. So guys, if I can help you avoid that experience, I think it's a lesson learned.
Do you think that unconscious incompetence is very something that is really equated with youth, or can we all fall victim to that all the time? Certainly when you're young, you don't know what you don't know. But is that something we have to be on guard for throughout our lives?
100%. I think we're all in different stages in different things. And, I want to say something, a bit, may or may not be fair, but it's almost like, if I look at my boys and my daughter, somehow my daughter was born in conscious incompetence. So the boys were born reckless in some ways. So you would see them do things and crash and do things that the girls, my daughter was a lot more cautious. So I think it depends with people's personalities. It's not a boy-girl thing, but some people are more naturally aware that they don't know. But I think in general, most of us tend to overestimate a little bit what it is. Think about skiing, who goes like down, or riding a bike, or I think the key thing is when I hear how hard can this be, I go like alarm,
alarm.
How hard can this be, to make money trading and generating? That looks easy,
usually from a distance. And so looking at other people doing it.
How hard can this be is generally a sign of unconscious incompetence, I would say. So again, no rule, no boy, girl, no age. I think we're all.
But watch out for that. If you're saying that to yourself, how did you feel when you had that setback? Because clearly, as we just established, you're very smart. You're succeeding at mastering not only engineering but options. Get a good job in London, so you're firing on all cylinders as a young person.
This lesson was also linked to Fomo, to fear of missing out in a way, or how everyone's doing it, everyone's kind of making money. I mean, I remember back in the desk, a bunch of us analysts and associates and whatever, and people were making at the time more money doing, trading, outside of the office. And it's almost like, why am I bothering coming here? And I can tell you, back in couple years ago, 3 years ago, with Bitcoin and crypto,
that's just what I was going to say.
I could see the movie. I was like, guys, I've seen this. So many people thinking, I'm going to quit my job, I'm going to do this, and I was the other guy. I never went that far whatsoever. I was very mindful. But I think that these cycles repeat themselves, and in some ways, these patterns happen over and over. But
people forget that was very much going on in the .com. Memories are short. Either if you weren't around, that's fine, but people were so concentrated on what it was, that it was crypto. No, it's just it's something that
it's a pattern.
You're seeing
it happens
that kind
again
of new
over
asset
and over and over.
Yeah,
and will continue to happen.
Yeah, but it's interesting you talk about FOMO because we're so conscious of FOMO now, but that's also always been around, and it's really powerful.
Well, it's human nature. Is behavioral. I think it's part of how we're wired, and you need to be aware of it, and it's hard sometimes, to think that you're missing out, and people capitulate, and I think this is part of the process, understanding. I think the other framework I use every single time is similar matrices: decision versus outcome, right? This is a world where you control, you can make a good decision and you should expect to get a good outcome. You could make a bad decision and expect to get a bad outcome. The challenge happens when you make a good decision and you have a bad outcome, right? That can generate a lot of frustration. Or even worse, you make a bad decision and you get a good outcome, right? So
it's funny you say that's even worse.
Yeah, it's even worse. It's a little bit like playing Russian roulette, right? Mm-hmm. The normal thing is normal things you should win, right? But that bad decision can actually lead you to do it again, and eventually things happen. So yeah, I think these frameworks are very helpful. I think they're actually linked because it's almost like the human behavioral emotional thermometer is also linked to your stages in trading. So stage 1 of unconscious incompetence tends to come with anger. So when you face one of these situations, be it you're losing money or you're having what you thought was a good idea and something happened, anger is generally associated with unconscious incompetence, right? When you move up, you start to experience frustration. So when you know that you don't know, you're frustrated.
So this is your second trade, and this is conscious.
Exactly.
Competence.
So the second level of I'm linking a little bit this idea as the second level. If you're feeling frustrated when you have things going wrong, it's quite likely that you're in stage 2. And I think the emotions is a very good thermometer to where we are.
That's true. I would say anger and disbelief for the first one, because you're also like, oh, that was wrong. I didn't know. But this one is frustration because you kind of know you're wrong.
Yeah, frustration, and exactly. I think once you go from there, the level 3 is acceptance. Something happened. I'm okay. I knew what I was doing, whatever. And when you're truly at the master level, is complete indifference. So you make money, you lose money. There's no.
All right, emotion. That's crazy. We're getting ahead of ourselves. So let's talk about when you know you don't know. So for the checker, what was an example for you that you remember?
I think there's a very interesting trade, and I'd like to link it to people on emotional trading. And I was already a bit more experienced. I had I started to be given, in the beginning, you're just supporting, you're doing stuff. And then eventually you start to get some risk, no? So a little bit of allowance to put positions, to do certain things. We're all managing a common book, but you start to have your own little stuff to play around. So I remember I had a position at the time, it was in gold, and I was very convinced, that this thing was going a certain way. Things were not going that way, and so the market got to a point where I went to my boss and I said I'd like to double the position, and he said, why? And it's like, well, because I think this, then that. It's like, okay, fine, but I want you to sell the trade and then you buy twice. And I was like, you're crazy. I mean, why would I sell it and then buy twice? Isn't it just paying bid offers and commissions and whatever? It's like, just do it. I was like, okay, fair enough. So I go to the guy and say, I need to sell 10,000 ounces. Well, and then I was like, and I didn't buy it, because once you're out of the trade, once you stop out, once you're physically out of the trade, suddenly it was like, do I really want to put the new position again? And it was so obvious. My boss was laughing, like looking at me, because he knew what was happening. And so in some ways, doubling up the position was a highly emotional decision. And the stop loss, effectively what it did is it got me out. And then he would have been perfectly okay if I had doubled the position as such. but the discipline of exiting and being okay emotionally with losing that money. If someone's playing poker or whatever, is folding. It's, if you are effectively racing just based on emotions alone, you might be making the suboptimal decision. So what I learned then, I was already more experienced, but I really learned the importance of stops and effectively trying to be as unemotional as possible. And it was like a light bulb that went.
Yeah.
And I thought I'd share with
I think that's so interesting, because you could literally go through that process. Anybody who's thinking about doing something, instead of just adding to an existing, think about if you exit and had to put it on again and have to go through the sort of process that you go through, even if it's quick, about whether this is the right decision. That's a completely different kind of part of your brain that you're using.
And I think, the idea of, well, I'll skip that part, is actually cutting corners. And,
yes, because you're not thinking about your framework at all.
And I think it's important to have the discipline to exit. There's a bit of additional cost. And then you're looking at that opportunity with a complete fresh look. Plus, suddenly there are many other opportunities that might be better deployment of your capital in cash. So I think sometimes we fall into that trap. We get into corners that is very difficult to get out, and that emotional aspect of trading or investing becomes even worse. The hole becomes even deeper. And so I think it's extremely important to honor those stops and profits in some ways, although there's no magic formula, but certainly that discipline, putting things in writing, ideally setting the orders, letting them go through, and then reinitiating, it's very powerful. So yeah, I think some of the best traders I've met, it depends on the banks, where trading is different to a hedge fund. It's almost like every morning they looked at the world, from scratch. And it's like, but yesterday you were saying, it's like, but things have changed. So that's incredibly important.
I've heard people, we've had people on who talked about that, especially long-term. Interestingly, commodity people seem to really do that. I don't know if it's because of the nature of those markets and how quickly they can move. But I know Peter Brandt, all of them will say that they sort of like restart and look at everything, even if it's just from a theoretical perspective to reboot. I'm thinking to myself on a much more pedestrian level that it's very similar to if you're out having a really good time and people convince you to keep staying out, as opposed to saying, I'm just going to go home and change. The chance of you going back out again, because you have to think about, should I really be out this late?
Absolutely.
Am I going back out? Am I committed to doing that? Do I have to get up tomorrow? A completely different mindset than just carrying on and doubling down.
You just brought an analogy that is probably, brought the point home to a bunch of people.
I don't know what it says about my life, people, but that's the one that popped to mind. But so then what happens when we move on to the third trade? Now, this is where they're more positive, because we're talking about sort of the lessons learned and they're what we would consider bad trades. So now you're getting into the more positive trades.
Yeah. So, you advance your career, you become, more of an expert in certain things. And I wanted, as a third idea, I wanted to highlight, when I wrote my first book. And
now this is unconscious.
This is now we're moving into
You're moving into competence.
Conscious competence.
Oh, conscious competence.
You know,
yes, conscious.
You know what you know what you don't know. And look, I think writing a book was a big decision. It's a big commitment. And there's so much I learned from it. And I think in some ways Cicero, the Greek philosopher, said, if you want to learn, teach. And I would definitely agree with that. And in fact, I would say if you want to learn, write. And in some ways, writing the first book, you're kind of naive enough that you think, hey, I know enough and I want to share my message. And I think I did. I did know. But perhaps through the process of writing, you realize, maybe I didn't know it as well, or it forces you to structure your thoughts and ideas. So maybe I share this analogy. I use this framework, which I compare ideas to like Lego pieces, right? So I, having been quite experienced in the energy markets, I've developed a bit of a investment thesis, and then you're like, how do I tell the story, right? And you can tell the story in so many ways, chronologically, upstream, downstream, in terms of so many angles. And so the beauty of writing the book is you take all those Lego pieces, you put them on the table, and you see literally hundreds of ideas. Some are green, some are red, some are big, some are circular, they're all complete different shapes, colors, sizes.
Tiny ones that you can never find when you're trying to build one with your child.
But all those ideas are there. And so basically, for me, writing the book was more like, okay, let's order these pieces. So that my brain, I start by color, right? So let's just put the pieces. And when you do that, suddenly you say, what happened? Where's green? There's no green. When you had all the ideas scattered on the table, it was very difficult to know what's what, where's where. But when you order, you realize very quickly, okay, because we have a natural order, in this case, the rainbow, you could see there's no green. And that, in fact, happened in the book. It was the energy world is flat. It was this thesis of the flattening of the energy world. And the book was already very advanced. I had my thesis. And someone asked me, or I asked, through the process, how about renewables? How do they fit? Because I was touching on crude oil and gas and coal and, nuclear and many others. It's like, how about renewables? And my answer is like, how about renewables? Yeah. It's like, okay, let's think about it. So the beauty is that when I how about green? When I put that through the framework, sort of magic happened. Because not only it fit the framework, it actually became one of the strongest arguments in favor. So I feel safe in the distance, a bit like Mendeleev when he put forward the periodic table. There were actually two holes, if I remember correctly. And there were two elements that, according to his framework, were there, but they had not been discovered yet. And so when those elements were discovered, it was like, my God, it was predicted. So I think I had that sort of moment. And when you actually take your ideas and you structure in other dimensions, you go from size to small or whatever, you say, how about the tiny pieces? How about the big ones? How about the shapes? So by the time you've taken your ideas and literally sorted them out in every single possible dimension, and you research the areas that you're missing, your story is so much deeper and so much more profound. And so by the time you go to an interview with Raul or whoever, you're like, you pretty much covered a lot of stuff. It doesn't mean it's a complete, exhaustive
but you know it
picture.
Inside out. You have much more confidence.
But you have way more understanding than you did before I wrote the book. So I kept that discipline of writing ever since. It's been interesting. It's been incredibly powerful because it forces you to actually articulate and structure your own thoughts. And this is why some of my readers might complain about the length of some of the newsletters, but it is you write for yourself.
Yes.
First and foremost.
Yeah.
If that happens to help other people, I always find it fascinating that people actually get something out of it. But it's actually a process where you are forcing yourself to structure your own thoughts. And so I think I recommend whatever it is, gardening, football, paint, whatever it is, I recommend people write because it's an extraordinarily powerful process.
That's so interesting. Did you, at the point that you put everything out, some people stop when it's not, because there's some chaos to that. And the task of trying to categorize it or organize it, however one does that, can be daunting. It's sort of the opposite of the blank page. It's so much information that some people can walk away. Were you ever tempted to do that?
No, of course, in the sense that at the end of the day, but writing a book is a major commitment. You need time, and you need to find that time. And there's something that will give up. I have literally 3 books that I'm writing as we speak, but it's not those Lego pieces are in 3 different tables. And what happens is every time you pick up an article, an idea, or whatever, you park them there. So they don't have to be books. They're just areas of interest. And they just keep going. And it's a long-term...
But they're kind of growing. It's funny you mentioned a garden. It's kind of like the book is growing.
It's a long-term project. And they're there, they're alive, and they help you. And so ultimately, I think this process is helpful. And I think having those ideas, but you're right. I would say 90% or 85 to 90% of the time is actually ordering and researching the ideas. The actual drafting, in my particular case, it's easier.
Yeah.
I could write a book in, I don't know, if I just went on a holiday for a month, I'd probably get all done, provided all the ideas are in place. And that's really the bulk of the exercise.
Did you realize, I'm going to go back to the example of the book that you wrote on the flat energy world. Did you realize that the green was missing until you organized it? Did you think it was more baked before you laid everything out and realized there was a chunk that you hadn't really thought about? Was that a surprise?
It came up
to
through
you?
the process. It was a surprise to me. It came up through the process.
Isn't that interesting that you...
It was fascinating. It was that sort of eureka moment of, oh my God, I think we're up to something here. That was the validation for me that it was. And I think the key message I wanted to share from this trade also is very important, is the value of having an investment thesis.
Yeah.
Or a hypothesis. Okay. So every single trade should have an investment thesis. And why is this important? I go back to the emotional side of things. I mean, when I had that book, the question is, what would have happened if I have my book, everything's lined up, and someone asked me, hey, Diego, how about green? And actually green completely throws everything down. There's no book, or the book changes, or the direction changes. So the importance of the thesis is that it's not you that is wrong, it's the thesis. And so it makes it a very humbling exercise, because the fact that you're talking about an investment thesis already puts you into the position of I'm right until proven wrong, rather than the ego approach that most of us would have, which is, well, you told me to buy euro dollar, and then it's like, well, the thesis was this is what's happening, these are the risks. So the moment you detach yourself from my trade to an investment thesis, that emotional side of things changes, because then you adjust to new information and you take it in a completely different way.
You're much more willing to process that information.
It's again going back to the emotions, going back to that process. And so the fact that in that book things were reinforced was very powerful. But there's been instances where actually at first it looks like it's contradicting the thesis, but actually when you think about it, it brings a way bigger, more profound problem or exercise. So I think that very humble approach to investing, to the thesis, and to be able to adjust to new information and changes makes effectively the process, there's less friction, there's less fatigue. You're trying to flow and ultimately be as unbiased and as possible, and that impacts every single side of the trading, from the sizing to the entry to the exit and everything else.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit more of an information archaeologist, really. You're sort of on the road of discovery as opposed to making it about your personal ability. It's sort of the secret sauce of Google too. That's how they structure everything, right? They set up a thesis, they try to kill it. But exactly. and then it moves on, but they're always pumping new information and inputs in, because it's not really about a team's ability or competence. It's just about whether the project works.
That's right.
They've been able to really accelerate because of that. So the next one is the best and sounds like the most fun that we all want to get to, and that is the unconscious competence.
Yeah, I think once you reach, let's say, master level in whatever it is, and I think we all are. In some fields, it could be anything. In fact, one of the most difficult things about unconscious competence is that you are so good at it, so good that you can't believe people. You actually you're not even aware that you're as good, and so you won't. In my case, I could give you some examples, or in both directions. But my wife, for example, she has a very natural orientation ability, and I might get lost more easily. She will not believe. It's like, what do you mean? It's like, I don't know. It's like, for her, it's impossible to think that. How can you not know that?
I'm sure
Dublin is that way.
I'm sure she has some choice words when you're driving.
So no, I think the idea is that we're all think about the challenges. Think about what are you so good at that everyone recognizes that, but you take it for granted. And so in some ways, I think it was a bit of a revelation. I know, and I know it sounds like showing off or whatever, but we're all very, very good at certain things, and I think you need to find them. And the challenge sometimes is that you're not even aware that you're so good at them, because they're so natural to you.
Yeah.
And so you went back to maths, right, or whatever. It just came very naturally to me, and so in some ways, do you choose your dog or does your dog choose you, right? Career-wise, if you're able to flow and adjust to those areas where you're really, really good at, and you have that unconscious, competence, I think chances are you're going to be much better, much happier, much more productive. And so I think in that sense, managing career change is a bit of a discovery as well of, how we move. And yeah, in my case, look, started engineering, moved on to finance. I've been lucky to be on the buy side with some amazing firms, and the sell side, I've, reinvented myself a few times. And I think all those changes were very strategic. I think I've always sort of think very strategically long-term about the career. And there's been instances, for example, when I was to join Goldman Sachs, I had an offer from called a tier 2 bank that paid significantly more. And many people didn't understand why I didn't take that. But for me, it was very, very obvious that the MPV of the move, it was much better to work for the right team or the right franchise. You could think, I would rather play for Real Madrid or Barcelona or, for less money than for perhaps a tier 2 team. And I think that mindset of, being long-term, being strategic, flowing and adjusting your own career and path to things that you enjoy and you do well. And again, you might be naturally developing that competence. It's super important. So
I like thinking about it in terms of being unconscious, because I think two things. I think sometimes we don't give ourselves enough credit when we acknowledge that we're good at something, because as you say, it's unconscious to us. So we just sort of think everybody has it, which is not necessarily the case. So you need to kind of be aware of that and give yourself credit for that and lean into that. But also we've kind of trained ourselves to think killing yourself in hard work is a badge of somehow getting that experience. And while it's not bad in and of itself, it's not always the way that you get to sort of that level of wisdom.
I think you have this debate of talent versus work hard. And I love Tony Nadal would say working hard is a talent.
Yeah.
And I strongly believe in that. And I think being proud of, working hard.
But if you hate it and it's not your area, if it's not an area of flow, then sometimes it's not going to.
You have to reflect. You have to reflect on these things. And unfortunately, beggars ain't choosers, right? We need to take certain jobs. We need to do certain things. And I think the attitude there, even, I love my degrees, but there were subjects that I was like, oh my God, this is not something I'm particularly interested about. But I always try to sort of take the positive side of, okay, someone's devoted their life. There must be something we can take out of this.
Even if it's what I don't want to do anymore.
In other cases, the only motivation was like, I just want to take this exam once. So,
and I'm never going to do that again.
Whichever it is, I'm doing this.
Sometimes knowing what you don't want to do is as important.
Absolutely.
When you sort of are in that fourth stage, is it hard to be a teacher when you can't believe that no one else knows it? Is that something we have to be aware of? You know what I mean? Like if you know it so well, how can you teach it to others? No,
the fact that you know it so well becomes more intuitive, but I think it's almost the ability to simplify the process. So, Einstein, would say if you can't explain it simply enough, it's because you don't understand it well enough. Or Feynman in his framework would say, explain it to me as if I was a 5-year-old. And the answer is, if you cannot do that, then probably you don't know it well enough. And I think that's kind of a corollary of what we're discussing in terms of that work. So don't confuse being very good at something with necessarily the ability to explain it. I'm sure Messi or, Ronaldo or Federer, they're things that they look, reflexive and not very natural. There is a lot of work. There's things that become natural, second nature. But I think sports is a good example of how you develop that level of competence. And some of it is talent, some of it is hard work, but let's not fool ourselves. I think at that, the learning process is an asymptotic process, meaning you're never quite going to get to 100%, and there might be different leaps. And that incremental, marginal improvements from the competitive sports, what's the difference between Djokovic and Medvedev? In a certain match, it could be
on any given day.
It could be 1 point, it could be a fraction, one ball that went in and out, and so we're talking about games of very small differences. And I think this is also true in investments. It's a game of small differences. The difference between, being stopping out and the right size. And so what it means is that every tiny little thing matters, right? And there's a process here. So when you think about going back to the framework, when I teach, I love teaching. It's just something I will 100%, I think, if I can, in my career as a professor. And I think that comes also as part of perhaps my competence. But I was teaching sort of the 4 stages of trading, and perhaps that'll be a separate discussion one day. But yeah, that level of how you start thinking, I want to be correct. Mm-hmm. So the idea of why are you buying this, because it's going up, then moving on to understanding the concept of expectancy. It's not just a probability, it's a game of asymmetry. Then understanding position sizing, because even with the positive expectancy, position sizing can actually destroy the trades. And then lastly, the art of portfolio construction, which is really where I'm spending most of our time today, as effectively in the analogy of the football team, being the goalkeeper and explaining the value of the team, and not just the striker, the goalkeeper, but also the value of this rebalancing alpha, which if we were to extend to other examples, we could bring to any other sport, basketball, football, or others. So I think in that sense, there's a ton of things that are connected, that are linked in many ways about how we learn. And I think this idea of analogies is fascinating, because I find analogies, they're reflexive. So I could explain to you or to my mom a problem in her language. And the fascinating thing is not only she will understand it, she will actually ask me in cooking terms.
Yeah.
The question that if I translated back into my world was exactly the right question to ask.
Which would never happen.
Which would have never happened in my world.
Right.
And so in some ways, it's like speaking different languages, and why I think maths or English is such important. They're languages and worlds that if you connect. And so I'm passionate about that. It's an area that I think, in particular science and physics and markets have tons of relationships. We saw it with Black and Scholes, but there are tons of things that can be explained, and there's already a lot of literature or understanding. And so I'm fascinated by this idea of, interdisciplinary knowledge, and effectively bringing down those silos and elevating our knowledge.
It helps people understand. I often say that it's living at the intersection where things are interesting. And I think especially when it comes to understanding this kind of stuff, did people who knew you when you were an engineer or starting out or just getting into options, would they be surprised that you're an author and that you think about things so much in terms of writing and communication? Because those aren't always skills that are associated with engineers.
The first person that is surprised that I wrote a book, it's me. Because I can tell you that it didn't come naturally. Yeah. I'm a bit of a perfectionist. I have these ideas, and I had to create a bit of a framework. So if you read my books, for example, it's a bit like we discussed earlier, but it's almost like you build a skeleton and then you start with bullet points and then you fill them up. So if you read my book, you could read just the first line of each paragraph. That's the message. Then I explain, and they have a punchline. Every single paragraph has a self-contained idea. So in some ways, you could read my books just by reading the first line. If you're like, I didn't quite understand, I'll explain. But that helped me move forward, because otherwise that paragraph, I could continue to write it and rewrite it forever. But in bullet point, it worked. So something that was not natural to me, like drafting, but the ideas and the bullet points and the ordering and the analysis comes very naturally. The drafting doesn't. So I needed some sort of formula to help me draft. And I think that is how I got around it. But yeah, otherwise, I think there are tons of things, we look back and, with my friends, we all had certain traits. You could tell who was more of a, let's say engineer, or who was going to be a lawyer. And and many of us followed our parents' paths, or some of us went in completely different directions. Yeah. But yeah.
What would, as we wrap up, what would your advice? You just gave so much good advice to people who are, earlier on the journey, I'd say, or maybe thinking about taking a little bit more control over their financial life. What was some parting advice that you would give them?
I think you need to find a trading strategy that fits your personality. And so I'll go back to sports just to make my point. If you told me, Diego, we have all these guys that play tennis, I mean, look, I'd love everyone to play like Roger Federer, right? But it doesn't happen, right? Some people are going to be naturally fighters. They're going to be more like Rafas. Some people are going to be more like, Djokovic. Some people are going to be more like Federer. Some people are going to be, ultimately, you are yourself. And so there are traits from Rafa or Roger or any that you can pick on, but you have to be yourself. And so I think it comes down to what's the trading style that fits your personality best. I can tell you, for example, I will stress out with positions that have open risk and have stop losses because I'm watching the screen. But my personality fits very well with long dated options, things that I know I have plenty of time to be correct. I know my downside. The market can go against me. The market could say this option's worth 0. I'm fine. That's your view. I have 3 years to be right. And even if I'm wrong, it's sized the right way. So my natural evolution, my dog picked me, right? In the sense that you are adjusting your style. And there are people that did the exact opposite. They stress out. They buy an option and they bleed and they decay, and they're very comfortable trading. So I think in that sense, my advice would be, control the risk. First and foremost, watch out for, position sizing, and just, in general, it's a game of staying alive and being able to protect your capital and compound. And I think as you do that, the answer is there's no right or wrong. There are thousands, infinite ways of making and losing money, just like there are infinite ways of playing tennis or different games. But I think you have to be honest with who am I, what comes more naturally. And so if you happen to have unconscious incompetence in biotech, you love it and you're really good at, that's probably something you should explore further. Yeah. And you will find that you're more likely to make money investing in biotech than pretending to trade oil, which you have absolutely no idea about. But at the same time, I would also encourage people to expand their circle of competence, with the caveat that the more wider you go, the bigger it gets. But I think it's about finding, this trading style that works for you, your personality, that comes easy, and most important, that you do without emotions, and that really sticks to something you excel at. And if you do that, I think chances are you'll be very successful. But the minute you feel anger, frustration, or even acceptance, there's some work to be done until you get to the point of emotional indifference.
Which sounds funny, but that's the goal.
Yeah, I think, again, let's go back to tennis. How many times, you see a point where the ball hits the net and goes to the other side, or the guys that start screaming and, Roger Federer wouldn't blink. It just goes like, okay, why? Because he knows the next time the ball will go on the other side. And it's a probabilistic game. So yeah, sometimes you're unlucky, sometimes you're lucky. Luck evens out in the long term. These guys have very different ways of looking at the world. Yeah, someone like Rafa focuses on the process. The outcome for him is secondary, and I think there's lots of lessons to apply and learn from these guys. So I think the goal is find that level of competence, and the thermometer is going to be how do you feel, and ultimately how are you doing.
Great stuff, Diego. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Maggie. It's been my absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Hey there, revolutionaries. To join a community sharing insights like you just watched, head over to realvision.com. There you will get unbiased insights and exclusive access to the very best, brightest, and biggest names in finance. Be a part of our community of lifelong learners. See you there.